the Chinese spy. Now we know the name. Yang Tengbo was Prince Andrew's man in Beijing and had visited Buckingham Palace on at least 2 occasions. I mean, what's that all about? Despite being told that Beijing has thousands of agents that could emulate the alleged spy, Keir Starmer has said he defended fostering closer ties with the country. Will this be a good thing for the UK? Or should we stay away from President Xi and China? As far away as possible, some would argue. Let's speak with Cindy Yu, Chinese affairs reporter at The Spectator. And if you haven't heard it, I suggest you go to the host of the Chinese Whispers podcast. It is just marvellous. Check that out as well. Cindy, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon.
Well, I mean, this is an area you know very, very well. You're right across this. Your first response to the spy story then, this fella that suddenly, you know, we discover almost out of nowhere has been, you know, up close and personal with the royals and working alongside Prince Andrew in some capacity and pressing the flesh with David Cameron and Theresa May to boot.
Yes, well, I've got lots of different responses to this one, reactions. I mean, one is that is Prince Andrew really the most influential target he could have picked?
Yes, yeah, he's clearly a bad spy if he is a spy, because you wouldn't... It's the last one on the list you'd have gone for, isn't he, really?
Exactly. So that's rather flippant. And I think, but there's a more serious point now, which is that I think the Chinese tend to think the monarchy is more important than it is, and that anyone with a royal title is more important than they are, especially Prince Andrew. So that demonstrates a lack of understanding of how the UK works to me. To be more serious, though, this is obviously, a very concerning development. And I think what's happened is that this is a bit of a legacy from the so-called golden era, where British businesses and people were encouraged to do lots of business with China. And there was often not enough thinking behind that of, should we be doing this? Who are the savoury characters? Who are the unsavoury characters? And also for people like Prince Andrew, I don't know if he had any security services guidance on his Chinese business dealings. Did anyone in MI5 preemptively say to him, this is how we can vet people for you. These are the organisations that you should be wary of, so on and so forth. So in some ways, nobody expects Prince Andrew to be a China expert, that he would just simply know whatever Chinese businessman rocks up is savoury. But I feel like there should be more guidance on people who do business dealings with China to have that if they don't have it.
And you would apply that to other states where there is a level of friction. You'd apply it to Russia. If suddenly a Russian turned up at Buckingham Palace, you'd like to think somebody in the security services would have a little look and just run their name through the database just in case.
Well, I guess actually Russia's a great example because we have taken so much Russian money, both in terms of investment in the City of London. The Conservative Party has lots of Russian donors that are relatively Kremlin-linked, and only when there is a big source of tension, like the war or Putin's annexation of Crimea back in 2014, do people then think, oh gosh, should we be doing this? And I guess we're seeing a similar reckoning moment for China now. For me, that the answer is not to not do these engagements. We should still continue to engage with China, continue to trade with China, but it's just about how do we do that in an informed way that doesn't leave people like Prince Andrew vulnerable to what's possibly exploitation.
Yeah. In terms of the wider question about how close we should be with China, we've been running through the things that China gives the world, if you like. I don't mean that in a benevolent way, obviously, but in terms of what they manufacture and what they make. In fact, it's easier to list what China don't make and manufacture because, of course, they are dominant in everything from your fridge freezer, your phone, solar panels to electric cars now. I mean, then it's not going in reverse gear anytime soon. I mean, this is a powerhouse and it's here to stay.
Yes, it absolutely is here to stay, and even more importantly, the Chinese Communist Party is here to stay. And I am not certain what kind of external pressure can be brought in order to basically instigate regime change. So let's assume that the Chinese Communist Party is here to stay, that the Chinese economy is going to be giant and important for the foreseeable future. So how should we engage with that? I think, you listed off so many different things there. A lot of these high-tech areas, I think, should be considered more sensitive than, for example, low-level of manufacturing. You had a person texting in earlier saying that they don't buy things from eBay from China. I'm pretty relaxed about that. if you're buying clothing or toys or something like that that's produced in China, I think that's not really a national security risk. But if we are relying on China for things like solar panels that are necessary for our green transition, EVs that are necessary for our green transition, things that could have national security implications, such as surveillance technology, that I think is where we should be focusing our attention on. And let's be clear about, getting closer or further from China isn't just a binary thing. We should be thinking about the industry by industry, product by product.
Just talk us through a little, if you could, Cindy, about the regime itself. This curious, it's still a communist party. The president is actually the chairman still of that party. It has an incredibly questionable track record of human rights right up to the present day. This isn't something in the past. This is something that there are massive question marks and concerns about as we speak. And yet, despite all of that, it has this veneer of being sort of the arch capitalist country of the planet now, more so than the United States. I mean, there's a part of me that wants to go, wow, that's incredible. You can control all your people still. It's a one-man band, ultimately. The statist approach reigns supreme. It's not quite North Korea, but it's a nod to North Korea. But at the same time, you're relaxed about making shed loads of money. I mean, this is an incredible story in itself.
Yes, I would put it as authoritarian capitalism. It's capitalist insofar as the authoritarian at the top still has total control. And basically, we've seen that in the last 20 years where economic reforms have meant that Chinese businesses have been encouraged to go out into the world or invest domestically, or just to really kind of push the boundaries out in terms of doing business within China and outside of China. But then in the 2010s, we saw a crackdown from Xi Jinping on Chinese businesses because he realized that actually the Chinese homegrown tech sector was becoming a bit too powerful. That people like Jack Ma inspired more respect amongst the people than perhaps the general secretary of the Communist Party. And so he cracked that down. So it's always very clear who comes first in terms of the party or the private sector. Nevertheless, underneath that, the private sector is given a lot of free rein. So, things like workers' rights, for example, in China are not actually very well developed. Things like social welfare are not very generous at all. And so in some ways, some European countries are more socialist than China is to live in. So it is a curious mix. And the fundamental fact is that the CCP is incredibly pragmatic. They'll pick and choose whatever bits suit them as long as the party remains in power. So I would probably call it a party with a country attached. You mentioned this difference between the general secretary and the president. Xi Jinping is both, but it is actually in his role as general secretary of the party that he has this power. The presidential title is only really ceremonial. Yeah. So this is a whole political system that is operating a different way to what we understand in the UK.
Is it likely to change? I mean, what's interesting, because the problem, if you are commercially so powerful and you are the country that's making the solar panels, you're taking and even beating on certain times of the year Tesla in terms of manufacturing, then the days of laughing at somebody wearing a pair of shoes that had made in China written on a label are gone. I mean, this is a serious contender. It could overtake the United States. Now, do you see that genuinely happening, Cindy? Could that be a reality inside the next few years?
I was definitely more optimistic about that overtake before than I am now, more confident that it would happen than I am now. And what's changed is the pandemic, actually. There are studies on this where think tanks have looked into China's rate of growth compared to the US's rate of growth. And actually, the Chinese economy is shrinking as a proportion of the size of the American economy. So it's actually not catching up in recent years, and the pandemic is a huge reason for that. If they invade Taiwan, that would be another huge blow to any hopes of becoming the world economy, because it would be so economically damaging. And there are lots of issues within the country itself as well. For example, the real estate sector is in this kind of slow motion collapse, and that accounts for a quarter of Chinese GDP. So if the issues there are structural and you can't solve them very easily, I actually see China's economic growth slowing down in the next few years, such that it may never overtake the United States. Things were definitely looking rosier for China in the early 21st century than they are now in terms of that overtaking. Nevertheless, it's unlikely to suddenly become irrelevant. It will maintain this big rhetorical, economic, and geopolitical power for a long time.
And how do people like yourself view China? I mean, what's your, in terms of your own story, your family story, etc., what is your own, I mean, do you look at it and go, oh, this, I wanted it to be this country, but maybe it will be one day, but sadly it hasn't happened. So along with many others, and areas such as Hong Kong being the obvious example, people legged it and decided to go and live elsewhere. What's your own sort of view? Do you have any romantic attachment to the place?
Oh, I absolutely do. I'm very proud to be Chinese. I'm proud of our history, our culture, the literary references that people make. I think it's a deeply fascinating civilization that I'm incredibly proud to be a part of. At the same time, I would, of course, love for there to be freedom of speech within China, for there to be democratization in China. And, whenever I see other East Asians from Taiwan or South Korea or Japan, I'm always asking them, how do democracies in your country work? And how does that work with a kind of East Asian outlook on life? Because that's what the Chinese are always told, that democracy wouldn't be suited to this country. We just simply don't have the political, philosophical fabric for it to make sense. So I'm always trying to learn from these other countries that have made democracy work and to have made the transition work.
Yeah.
But I have to say, what I'm worried about is democratic transition in and of itself. You look at the Arab Spring and how unsuccessful that has been for so many countries that had better hopes for itself. We're seeing what's happening in Syria only the last few weeks. So I have to say, very cautious in terms of the success of democratic transition, because it could go so badly.
Yeah.
And there are great examples of it working well, but I'm not sure what the secret sauce is to make it go well. And if that is, if turmoil and civil war and turbulence is what China will have if it tries to go down that route, then it's hard for me to say that I want to push it down that route, because I'm just afraid that it could go so much worse.
Yeah, so it's kind of be careful what you wish for sort of territory, isn't it, in a strange kind of way. Listen, Cindy, we will speak again. That's been really fascinating to get your take on this. Cindy Yu is Chinese affairs reporter over there at The Spectator. She's also the host of the Chinese Whispers podcast. Because of her own background, her own lineage, she knows this territory perhaps better than most, but writes very realistically about it. And I thought that last point's really interesting.